Baltimore, one of America's most violent and deadly cities. On the streets, its citizens are fighting to turn back the tide. But what are the politicians doing? In this election year, we look at crime, punishment, and policing in America.
On the streets of Baltimore, I'm Avi Lewis, and this is Frontline USA. It's no wonder that some of American TV's most highly acclaimed police dramas are set in Baltimore, from Homicide: Life on the Streets to The Wire. This is one of the toughest and grittiest of U.S. cities, and all of America's fault lines run right down the middle of it, from gang violence and murder and drug addiction to poverty, racism, and corruption. In the language of universal human rights, governments at all levels, from the White House to City Hall, have failed to provide human security to the people of Baltimore. But in our short time here, we've met a host of local citizens who are struggling to transform their embattled communities. And they're not all the kind of people that you might expect. A former drug kingpin and murderer reformed. A high school student who specializes in algebra and direct political action. A longtime police officer who's now a TV producer and best-selling author. On this week's Frontline Focus, we follow their fights on the streets of Baltimore.
If there's one thing you can't avoid in Baltimore, it's nostalgia. Once America's second leading destination for immigrants, mainly the Irish, Baltimore became America's third largest city. Later, it was a major shipping and manufacturing hub. Today, the port is a shadow of its former self. Industry has fled, and the population has been in decline for decades. The economic hardship and racial disparity here are major factors in Baltimore's notorious crime statistics. Nearly 300 murders a year, linked to a heroin trade that fuels a similar number of deaths by overdose. The murder rate here is nearly 7 times the U.S. national rate, making Baltimore more deadly than Bogota. But there are no statistics or context that can fully convey the reality of violent crime, the effects of which are always intensely personal.
I think about him every day. It's not a day that I don't think about him.
Jean Carter lost her son Jamel to a sudden, random, and still unsolved shooting. He was home for a weekend from college, hanging out with friends from the old neighborhood. Sitting in a car on an autumn evening, someone walked up to the window and shot him at close range.
I just can't imagine how someone can be so violent to just take someone's life like that. It's a lot of young people in the city just killing our young boys, mostly.
Last year, Baltimore was the second most dangerous city in the U.S. with a population over 500,000. It's something Adrian Barnes can attest to. He works for the Violence Intervention Program. His clients are all young men who are at risk of violence, both on the giving and the receiving end. Like many community activists, Adrian's work springs from his own personal experience.
At that time, I was, 20? I just had a baby. It was hard, trying to work, take care of a child and myself, and that was really hard. So I wanted to go back trying to make some extra money, because that's what I was used to. I was used to selling drugs.
Adrian ended up here in this hospital with a gunshot wound. While recovering, he was asked if he wanted to participate in a study about violence intervention. The program's methods echo the unsentimental logic of the street itself.
Death is a normal thing to Baltimore City. It's a normal thing. They say it every day, all the time. We work with them when they come to the hospital. They've been shot, stabbed, anything like that, but they're on their bed. And they're very vulnerable at that time, and our mission is to grab them right then and there and try to get them moving forward.
Donnie is a former drug kingpin and convicted murderer.
And back in the day, I used to roam through here, do my little robberies and stuff like that.
He's now back on the streets after a long stretch in prison.
I only need help for 2 days to get to work. Every other church I've been to said, come back Monday.
I've been locked up about 19 times, I did 2 big bits. The last one I did for murder. I was hooked up with a drug organization, we committed a murder, fighting over turf. I got to be life sentenced. I was one of the best drug dealers in the city, but it was born. It it was born just sitting around, you know, selling stuff, collecting money, you know, sitting on the steps all day. You know, I think with me it was the excitement, the excitement of seeing somebody face when you pull the gun out, you know, especially you got the ones, yeah, I wish somebody would come over and try to rob me, and then all of a sudden you say, okay, let's give it up. You know, and then see the expression like, okay, you was a tough guy 5 minutes ago, what's up?
Eventually, Donnie got tired of the game. He turned state's witness and got a deal, but still served 18 years in jail. Along the way, he became friends with Ed Burns, a writer and TV producer who also happened to be the former cop who put Donnie away in the first place. And so, parts of Donnie's story have been immortalized. One of the main characters on the hit TV show The Wire is based on him, Omar Little.
And here I am. How about that?
In Donnie's new life, he's a community outreach worker and head of security at one of Baltimore's most important churches. Donnie counts Pastor Frank Reed as a close friend. As head pastor at the historic Bethel Church, he's one of the city's most visible black leaders.
When the people organize for change, then the politicians and the policy will change. And no matter how bad things look, if we begin to organize and turn to each other instead of turning on each other in violence and drug addiction, once we turn to each other, then we can change the politics and policy of our community.
Baltimore is a city that has gone through every fad in policing of the past 30 years. Most recently, the one known variously as the broken window, New York City, or zero tolerance model. The idea is to sweep through rough neighborhoods with a wave of quality of life arrests for drinking on the street, possession of drugs, and other nonviolent crimes. After years of this approach and a murder rate that hasn't budged, Baltimore's city government has turned on zero tolerance, but the culture of policing is slower to change.
It's a war every day. You know, it may not be like Iraq or other areas, okay, and we may not be able to wear the flak vests and ride down the street in tanks. Sometimes I wish we could. Might be a little safer, but it is a war out there. It's us against them.
Us against them. Many in the community see it that way too.
Say for instance, like these guys are standing outside and stuff. The cops will roll up onto them and start checking their pockets and all this other stuff, and they ain't even doing nothing except for like out here cleaning up. They don't get the criminals. They mess with the ones that's not really doing that. That's what I see.
The truth is that Baltimore is a highly segregated city. While hundreds of millions of dollars have been poured into gentrifying the inner harbor to attract tourists and young professionals, the flip side is not so shiny. There are some 30,000 vacant houses in Baltimore. 30,000 visual reminders that the city has been gutted by forces beyond its control, that something is missing here.
What about all this fancy stuff at the port?
Oh, you mean the waterfront?
Yeah, the waterfront.
That's what we always say. Hey, look what we've done, and we don't even have any water.
It looks like a rich bubble. Because in a lot of the poor neighborhoods we've been in, people have been saying, they spend all this money on that. What about us?
Absolutely. I'm not dismissing that whatsoever. So let me get back to what I was saying, is that, what about us? I have a neighborhood in North Baltimore that has several blighted blocks because of drugs. We've had to fight very hard to get redevelopment money for the blighted areas there, and we don't have it all yet.
But for activists in Baltimore, a new impatience is taking hold. You can see it in a new movement among high school students for education reform.
We feel that education is fundamental in life. So if you're already cut out of an education, most likely you're going to end up in a crime area, in prison, or dead.
Chris Goodman is part of a high school mentoring program called the Algebra Project. Recently, they marched on the state capitol and declared it a crime scene.
This is a crime scene investigation.
A member of the group was shot and killed last year, and the students see a direct link between education cuts and violence in their community.
We want your pity, we want funding for our city.
Because we see, okay, look at all the people who grew up with us, drop out of high school, drop out of middle school, and they still have to eat, they still have to work, and you're not receiving a quality job, a living wage. then you're going to resort to other means to provide for yourself and your family, and that leads to incarceration, that leads to death.
The Algebra Project is bringing a voice to the voiceless and creating some small ripples of hope for young people here. Back at the church, we asked Pastor Reed about hope for change at the federal level. Baltimore is a longtime Democratic Party stronghold. Is the prospect of a new administration in Washington a source of any optimism?
While there are many that are caught up in this election and the Democratic primary, because you could end up with a president of color, you could end up with a president who is a woman. The fact of the matter is, as great as those changes are, they won't make much of a difference in inner city areas until the people decide to make a change. The politics from the outside seldom make a real change.
Coming up on Frontline USA, the Baltimore edition. Barack Obama, the politics of race, and how the mainstream media covers the issue. We're back on Frontline USA, coming to you this week from Baltimore, a city on the front lines of the politics of race in America. Now, that issue has received more play in this election campaign than any other in memory. And of course, here in North America, it all comes to us through a mainstream media which is overwhelmingly white. On Election Post this week, Barack Obama, his firebrand pastor, his landmark speech on race, and how it was all covered. Here's Richard Gisbert.
Race was an issue that the politicians and the media had been skirting, but it has steamrolled its way into the coverage. This week on the Election Post, how good a job have the media been doing in covering the issue?
The issues of race and gender have come to dominate the Democratic contest.
Do you think President Clinton was engaging in racial politics there?
They associate her with remarks and yell, racist, racist, racist.
This was an issue that was always bubbling below the surface of the election story.
Race has always been an integral part of American life, and so I think it's been unavoidable in the media.
We've had a few campaigns with black candidates, but not one where the frontrunner was a black candidate, and that's created new challenges.
Eventually, the race issue came to a full boil when the U.S. news media gave Americans a glimpse of what goes on inside Barack Obama's church.
Reverend Wright has made a number of controversial statements over the years.
Barack knows what it means to be a black man living in a country and a culture that is controlled by rich white people. Hillary can never know that.
A largely white and relatively affluent United States press corps didn't really have the background to understand the level of anger in the black community. So I think they were genuinely shocked when they saw video clips of Reverend Wright saying things that are not uncommon in the African American community.
The controversial remarks from Barack Obama's former pastor. Boy, you know, the Reverend Jeremiah Wright has come under fire for saying the United States is racist.
I think what you saw in the media was people who didn't understand that, who couldn't put that in context, and instead you saw reports of racist, anti-American, inflammatory comments from Barack Obama's pastor. But in a historical context, I think the media was not in a position to address that simply because they didn't have that context to give.
So the candidate challenged the news media, particularly television, with its tight time frames and penchant for conflict-driven coverage, to deal with the complex issue of race in a different way.
We can tackle race only as spectacle, as we did in the O.J. trial, or in the wake of tragedy, as we did in the aftermath of Katrina, or as fodder for the nightly news, or at this moment, in this election, we can come together and say, not this time.
Obama's speech mesmerized some parts of the U.S. news media.
There is a real possibility that this day, and a speech given on this day, will go down as one of the most important moments in the campaign of 2008.
What I personally view as the best speech ever given on race in this country.
But the Obama effect was all too temporary.
The second day story about this speech, it was about the way he compared his pastor's extremist comments about whites to the way his grandmother, who's white, had used a couple racial slurs in his presence.
I can no more disown him than I can disown my white grandmother.
The way she was afraid when she saw black teenagers on the street.
and who on more than one occasion has uttered racial or ethnic stereotypes that made me cringe.
People started asking, well, why does he bring his grandmother into this?
To say she is a typical white person, if anybody said something like that on the radio, oh, he's a typical black man, he's a typical Hispanic.
Are you offended by Barack Obama yesterday referring to his grandma as a typical white person?
And that led to an extraordinary exchange on Fox News' morning show, when the anchor of another Fox broadcast came on to criticize his own colleagues for their coverage of the race issue.
It seems to me that 2 hours of Obama bashing on this typical white person remark is somewhat excessive, and frankly, I think you're somewhat distorting what Obama had to say.
So have the U.S. news media raised their game and met the challenge issued by the man who could become America's first black president?
We can play Reverend Wright's sermons on every channel, every day, and talk about them from now until the election, and make the only question in this campaign whether or not the American people think that I somehow believe or sympathize with his most offensive words.
And their response was very clear.
The U.S. of KKKA.
They continued to play the minister's tapes 24 hours a day.
God damn America!
And did not address the issues.
Here's a guy who had to give a speech because he'd been in this close relationship with a raving racist.
No one can say these things this often and still be considered a rational, tolerant person that should have access to the guy who might be sitting in the Oval Office.
We're back here next week on the Election Post with more on the media and the U.S. elections here on Frontline USA.
Ed Burns was a cop in this town for 20 years, and when he got tired of the game, he became a high school teacher. Got a little education in the reality facing young people here. He went on to become a best-selling author and co-creator of a TV show called The Wire. All of these projects set in Baltimore and woven into the fabric of this city. I got a chance to talk to Ed Burns and walk the streets of Baltimore with him. Here are some highlights from our conversation. Crime has dropped dramatically in America in the 1990s into this decade, but in places like Baltimore, not so much. Why is that?
It hasn't dropped in Baltimore because in Baltimore the economy never kicks in, because the economy now is in China or someplace else. So there's no opportunity, and the only world that's open to you in Baltimore is the drug world, and you're either a player or a user or you're on the edge, and that doesn't give you a whole lot of hope. Well, 2 years ago, Baltimore arrested 110,000, 115,000 people. Well, there's only 600,000 people, 620,000 people in Baltimore. That's an awful lot of people to arrest, and that didn't do anything to the murder rate whatsoever. What the criminal justice system has become in America is sort of the guy sitting on the trash can lid. But we've been sitting on the lid for like 40 years, and by sitting on that lid, nothing's gotten better.
An astonishing statistic came out this past month that more than 1 in 100 Americans, adults, are in jail. America has 2.5 million people in jail. China, with a population more than 3 times the size, has only 1.5 million. What does the prison culture do to the overall community?
It demonizes. It's a demonizing process. For me, if democracy is to work, you need an underclass that's revolutionary. It doesn't have to be bricks and bat revolution, but they have to be agitating for what they think is their part of the pie. We've muted these people, so it's incumbent upon those who still have a voice to speak up and try to change things.
Where do you see this project of criminal enforcement going in America?
After 9/11, order trumped freedom, and we gave up a lot of our freedom so we have this sense of order, we're protected. And if another shock should come to America, be it just a random shock or a staged shock, then it's quite possible that we could take the next step. I mean, there's cameras all over the place now, and it's what you can do with cell phones. I mean, it's unbelievable. So I mean, you can pretty much put a thumb, and if you're willing to lock people up at the rate we are, you could shut down the societies. I mean, you could shut down anything you wanted to. And
do you think America's really headed that way?
Well, that is a possibility for America. I mean, there is on the horizon, the political horizon, a chance for the Democrats to get back into office. But how much, you know, I'm not a great believer in the great man theory anymore. You know, there's a lot of things that are already set in motion. And the corporate mentality, the corporate mindset is pretty powerful. And the privatization is pretty powerful. And I don't know if that can be reversed.
Thank you.
Sure.
It's a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Before we go, there's one more story we'd like to share. The setting, a park in downtown Baltimore slated for sale and gentrification. The protagonists, a community of homeless people who have been living there for years, and a Catholic priest named Father Lawrence, who's been fighting City Hall to let them stay. The resolution? We'll let Father Lawrence tell you that in his own words. Until next time on Frontline USA, so long.
I'm Father Dick Lawrence, pastor of St. Vincent de Paul Church in Baltimore, lifelong Baltimore resident, 5-generation family, so I've seen a fair amount of what's going on around here. 10, 12 years ago, the city wanted to unload its parkland, so they sold this property or offered it for sale, and we figured we better buy it. These makeshift shelters have been put up by the guys themselves during the winter. The season for that is ending, so in a couple of weeks they will have to take them down. But they will still be able to stay here, still be able to sleep here. They don't vote, and therefore they don't get any influence. But there are a lot of people who care about them. Somebody else has to do some of the lobbying for them. This is so close to the bedrock principles of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, all the great monotheistic faiths. Saying, you know, if you are not merciful and compassionate, what right do you have to talk about a merciful and compassionate God? You know? So I can't run guys out of this park. If the mayor puts me in jail, I won't do that. The city itself, as opposed to the whole metropolitan area, is dying and rising at the same time. Yeah, we do have a violence problem, but 75–80% of it is inside the narcotics industry. There's an awful lot of money in narcotics. And we don't have organized crime in Baltimore. What we've got is thoroughly disorganized crime, which means every little gang of toughs, you know, stakes out its own little corner and then starts killing anybody who comes there. Well, that builds a culture of violence. And you got all these teenagers running around packing heat. If we got the guns off the streets, if we got the drugs off the streets, I think the gangs would probably go away by themselves. But oh no, can't do that. People have a right to their guns. Yeah.